Hey everyone, welcome back to City Skylines and to Douglas. My name is James, and in today's episode I'll show you how you can use boformer's building themes mod in combination with the district tool to up your zoning game and create a really nice density gradient throughout your cities. We'll be rezoning pretty much the entire core of the city here, as well as this neighborhood down by the waterfront. We'll also create some factory housing in our industrial district, and of course we'll keep an eye on our services, as I expect we'll get some big population growth today. First, let's recap. In the last episode, we built some much needed parks, focusing mainly on the East Mall here. There's still a lot of empty space, which we're leaving open for museums or other civic buildings that will unlock later in the series. Now that these parks are starting to level up, you can really see the effect on leisure access, which is pretty good across most of the city. I'm looking forward to trying out some of the other Park Life DLC parks, such as a zoo or an amusement park, in later episodes. So on stream and in between episodes, we expanded the street grid to the west and across the river as well. Hopefully now you can see how the East Mall will pair up with the future West Mall, which will go in this general area. And also how this rectangle of avenues anchors our street grid. I replaced a ton of road surfaces throughout the city, as you can see from these nice cobblestone roads here. I found this nice cobblestone tram road as well. I think this is probably my favorite network that I've gotten from the Steam Workshop. Speaking of streetcars, we did introduce a second streetcar line, which terminates over here at the industrial area, continues along M Street, crosses the railroad tracks, and goes up this way kind of into nothing right now, but I'm thinking we might continue this over this way towards these hills. We've also got buses now. For the moment, just one line, which sort of connects the two streetcar lines and goes in between them. It's also kind of acting as a school bus, as you can see. It goes in front of the high school here, and it's pretty popular with students during the rush hour part of the day. Now, unfortunately, the buses we have right now are not very well suited to the demand on this line. Here's one of those buses here. They're pretty small. Now, part of the issue here is that a lot of Sims are waiting for the bus when really they should just be walking because they're only going one or two stops. And unfortunately, there's not really much we can do about that other than making sure that our stop spacing isn't too close. Next episode, after we've had some more Sims move in, we could definitely look at revamping some of these transit lines, so let me know if that's something you'd like to see. I want to start things off today by explaining what building themes are in City Skylines. In vanilla, there are only two building themes, the international style and the European style. These styles apply across your whole city, and they're controlled by the map type that you select. So on European maps, you get the European style buildings, and on all the other map types, you get the international style. And each of these styles contain the buildings that are allowed to spawn in those respective cities. Now in vanilla only, this system is not very useful, because you're limited to only a single building style across your whole city. And this is where the building themes mod comes in. I think it's worth explaining this mod and how I'm using it because it really is essential to making Douglas look even remotely like the cities we're taking inspiration from. Now the building themes mod allows you to set building styles not only over your whole city, but over individual districts as well. So for example, in this district, we have it set to the brownstones theme at the moment, and this one is in the streetcar suburb theme. So you can also create building styles in game via a tool called the theme manager, and this is open through the city policies tab. The mod adds a new tab over here called themes, and then you can open the theme manager from that tab. If you don't want to create your own styles, you can download them pre-made from the Steam Workshop. And importantly, only buildings included in a particular style will be allowed to spawn in a district set to that style. So for example, in any of these themes that I've created, only the buildings I select here are allowed to spawn in them. So I wanted a bit more flexibility than using a pre-made theme, so as you can see I've created several of them that we'll be using in today's episode. And this is pretty easy to do. You just go to new theme, you name it, and then I can select buildings that I want to add to this theme. You can filter by zone type. So for example, I have it set to just residential right now. I can set it to all of them. I can just look at commercial. And I can also filter by the building level and the building lot size. Now, it's important that for each zone type you want to have in a district theme, for example, low density residential, that you include some level 1 buildings in that. Otherwise, nothing will be able to grow because buildings have to start out as level 1. So if you don't have enough level 1 assets you like, you can clone a higher level asset and then set it to be level 1 using this clone building tool here. So I can set this as level 1, I can clone it, and now next time I reload the game, this will be loaded and will be able to spawn as level 1 and then later on also as level 3. You can also do this in reverse, for example, setting a lower level asset to also grow at level 1 or level 2 or 3 or higher. And you can also set assets to have clones at all levels for improved variety. And I actually didn't know that this cloning feature existed until I started working on this episode, so that's why in earlier episodes you may have noticed some of my districts suffering in variety a little bit. So speaking of districts, that's kind of the name of the game here. And at the moment, ours are a complete mess. This one looks like a politician drew it. This one is split into 2 pieces. And yeah, I think we need to start fresh. Well, okay, these are probably even more of a mess than what we have before, but I can explain this mess. So essentially, our new districts follow the hierarchy of the street grid. Along the avenues and near major transit stops, we want the highest density. So this theme has 5 to 10 story apartment buildings, and you can imagine that the city grew at the end of the 19th century. These corridors would have densified the most, as they're where most of the activity happens within the city. So one step down from the avenues along major cross streets like this one, it's still high density, but the buildings will be a little smaller. And in all the in-between space, and as we go a little bit farther out from the core, we'll still be zoning high density, but thanks to this theme, what we'll get is medium density, either brownstones or row houses depending on what style we want in that neighborhood. And as you may have guessed from the title and thumbnail, I think these neighborhoods in particular are kind of special. Let me explain. As you may be aware, City Skylines does not have a medium density residential zone. You've either got detached homes and a handful of duplexes, or you've got 10 plus story tenements and high-rise buildings. Now, unfortunately, at least here in the USA, City Skylines is pretty well justified in its elimination of medium density zones. In most places in the US, it's actually straight up illegal to build the types of homes you'd expect in a medium density zone. Things like townhomes, row houses, fourplexes, and garden apartments. Because of this, you often see these types of housing referred to as missing middle housing, since they would fill that gap between single-family homes and taller apartment buildings. And pretty much the only place you can find the missing middle is in older neighborhoods in a handful of cities, or in the rare new development that was given a special permit. And it's precisely these older neighborhoods that we're recreating here in Douglas. Washington, D.C. is one of those few North American cities where the middle isn't missing. And the neighborhoods with brownstones and row houses are very much in demand to this day. In fact, you can very easily point to the absurd housing prices in DC or in other cities across the US as an indication that demand for these neighborhoods far outstrips the supply of them, since again, they just aren't allowed in most places. Of course, you might be asking why they aren't allowed, and the related question of why the only place you can find them is in pre-World War II neighborhoods. The quick and dirty answer to that question is that cars happened, and with them came the single-family suburbs that we know today. Of course, there's a lot more to it than that, but we'll get into the weeds of those topics once we get to the post-war period in this series. For now, we're still in a time when most people didn't own cars, at least in real life, and when zoning in general was actually a pretty new concept. Missing middle housing was the default, and we're building it here in Douglas for the same reason cities built it back then. It was dense enough to be walkable, and it's also cheap to mass produce. Well, I guess City Skylines doesn't really care about that second point, but it was a big deal in real life. We often don't think about brownstones, for example, as being cheap housing, but when they were first built, they were. Labor costs were much lower than today, and the material was easy to work with. I suppose the modern day equivalent would be something like a 5/1, which if you don't know are those modern apartment buildings that are going up in cities all over the US. They're cheap because the construction is mostly wood with cladding on the outside. In the background, you've been watching the second step of creating a density gradient, rezoning for high density. When you change the building theme on a particular district, buildings that don't match anymore aren't automatically destroyed, which is good since it means we don't lose literally our entire population. Instead, in the spots where we had brownstones but should now have slightly taller buildings, the buildings will just swap to the correct theme when they upgrade. Of course, buildings are destroyed by rezoning with the actual zoning tool, and as you can see, this is causing a lot of displacement, since we pretty much need to convert all of the low density zones in the core to high density. I'm not going to do this all at once because, as you'll see, we don't quite have the residential demand for that much housing just yet. Instead, what I'm doing is rezoning the areas along the corridors and then leaving a lot of the interior areas as they are for now. What I think we can do to simulate a more realistic growth process is to gradually rezone a few lots at a time as demand creeps up over the next few episodes. Once that process is complete, we'll have a better idea of how our zoning via districts experiment worked, since right now we're only seeing the level 1 buildings, and those don't paint a great picture of what the neighborhoods will end up looking like. My apologies if you were expecting to see everything done and dusted in today's episode, but I think it will take a couple of episodes for the buildings to get leveled up. While we wait for the core to develop, let's jump down to the Waterfront district. Firstly, I'm replacing the 4-lane road down the middle here with the beginnings of a multimodal boulevard. Right now we've just got these local side streets, but next episode we'll add a streetcar line with dedicated tracks, and later on we'll add some additional car lanes. I know, more car lanes isn't ideal, but I think we'll definitely need some kind of bypass road here for industrial trucks, so those deliveries and exports don't have to go through the commercial area along Old Main Street. And we won't want Sims driving their personal cars here, but it's important to consider that freight still needs to get around. And instead of bulldozing prime waterfront real estate for an elevated highway, we'll have space set aside for a surface boulevard with room for transit and bikes. In this district, I'm using our row house themes to create a bit of a different look from what we have west of the railroad tracks. These buildings are mostly from the excellent Brooklyn collection by FindBuild on the Steam Workshop. Starting out, I expect most of the Sims who move in here will work in the industrial area next door. That's great because we need the industry and we want Sims to be able to walk to work. I am leaving a couple blocks between the industry and the housing so our Sims aren't living on polluted soil. I promised we'd cover some hard-hitting topics in this series, and it's time we talk about redlining. You've probably heard the term before, maybe in association with working-class neighborhoods like the ones we're building right now. You might have heard these places called blighted, or maybe just known as the bad side of town. These connotations often obscure the context and history of a neighborhood, a history in which redlining played a big role. Let's break it down. In the United States, redlining was the practice by banks and other institutions of denying investment, services, and amenities to residents in neighborhoods considered hazardous or blighted. The delineation of neighborhoods by this perceived risk was typically a pretext for racism, used to prevent development or investment in minority, ethnic, and working-class neighborhoods. Redlining became widespread in the 1930s and was the MO of the Federal Housing Administration for decades. It's a textbook example of systemic racism. The divestment in redline neighborhoods exacerbated segregation and led to the urban decay we associate with redlining today. But what if we'd avoided it entirely? Can we, as the all-powerful, immortal mayors of Douglas, use a simulated city in a video game to rectify one of the deepest issues in American city planning? Well, maybe. This whole concept is a little beyond the depth of City Skylines. But here's what we can do. We'll make sure that our neighborhoods like this one have good access to city services, transit, education, and amenities like retail and parks. By boosting land value and zoning for local businesses, we're creating wealth in these communities, and we'll see that reflected as buildings level up. City Skylines doesn't simulate things like mortgage loans or landlords, but we could imagine that the City of Douglas has some kind of public housing or equitable lending program to counteract the influence of the big banks and the feds. And will avoid blight and urban decay, since our neighborhoods won't see sustained investment and poor services. The factory housing estate we're making right now could be an example of that sort of public housing, although apartments like these were also built by factory owners and companies to provide housing for their employees. And I know I just threw a lot of history at you, so thanks for bearing with me, and I hope you found that a little interesting or at least learned something. It's time we took a quick break from building to celebrate our next milestone. As I was working on the factory housing estate, we crossed the 15K mark and are officially a big city. This honestly happened faster than I was expecting, and just goes to show how much density we put down today. Importantly, we've now unlocked a new tile, as well as the Liberal Arts College campus area and a few important city service buildings, including the crematorium. All that population growth, however, means we have a few more things to take care of before we can wrap up this episode. Firstly, we need more jobs, and the only issue is we don't really have a good spot to put them. We've run out of space in our original industrial district, and we need to leave these blocks here open for next episode's project. Time for a quick and dirty, quite literally, industrial area over here by the abandoned factory and the landfills. Since we're right up against the edge of the tile, I'm just connecting this area back to Massachusetts Avenue via a 2-lane bridge that definitely won't cause any traffic problems. Next, here's a quick look at the current state of our finances, which I don't think I've shown you guys yet. Our tax rates are mostly at the default, but as you can see, we're still making a fair chunk of change. We've got room in the budget to expand some of our services, and we'll start with garbage. As you can see, the dead zone for coverage is toward the river, but I don't want to put down a landfill anywhere on the other side since we just have to move it and remediate the area later on. So instead, we'll just drop another small biogas digester, this is a workshop asset by the way, down here near the power plant. We'll also add another incinerator next to the sewage pond so we can empty the landfills there. And finally, we'll try out a recycling plant, which I'll put just beside the railroad tracks here. I'm not sure if recycling was really a thing in the 1920s, but selling metal for scrap probably was, and that's close enough for me. It's not just regular garbage that's piling up in Douglas. We've got human garbage as well, and by that I mean literal dead bodies. Fortunately, we just unlocked crematoriums, so we can plop one down right next to our original cemetery, and then we'll spread the love with a couple more cemeteries throughout town. Okay, now that that's all sorted, I think we're pretty much good to go. Douglas is running smoothly, and there's no major issues that need our attention. Oh no. You remember how I said that single connection to the new industrial area would be perfectly fine? Well, that may have been a slight miscalculation. In case you're wondering, making a sizable industrial area with no public transportation or direct highway connections is not ideal. Not to worry though, I've got a couple of ideas. I think a new streetcar and bus line, along with the highway connection for trucks via the new tile we unlocked, should sort this traffic out nicely. Unfortunately, I'm running out of time to get this episode out, so we'll have to save those projects for next time. Overall, I'm really pleased with the progress we made today. Most of our new neighborhoods are filling in, and we've even got a few buildings that have started to level up. Our density gradient is coming along well, and I think our missing middle neighborhoods give the city a lot of character, especially combined with the cobblestone and street trees, which I'm admittedly still experimenting with. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the episode. Next time we'll be working on Douglas's central train station, among other things, so if you have any ideas or suggestions, be sure to leave them down below. Oh, and by the way, you may have noticed I share this channel with my good friend Levi. He's developing a base building RPG called Eldrinth, and he just put out his first devlog. If you haven't already, be sure to check it out. His game has a lot of interesting ideas and it's definitely worth a watch. With that, I want to thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next episode of City Skylines.